In order to find the power source, you would either use a power probe. Power probe normally goes connected to the battery. These are typically more of a specialty type of tool. It's not necessary to have one, but of course it's the better option to use when you're looking for wires because it's more protected for the vehicle's electronic circuits and computer systems. A couple of different ways to be able to install this. The best method of installing the device would be to hardwire it and then come back and solder it. That way you have a nice permanent connection and you don't have to worry about the wires ever coming loose. And then of course you just come back and tape over it. In my instance, I like to put a zip tie on top of the wire, on top of the tape, just to make sure that it doesn't come loose. These are Scotch lock connectors, T-taps as they call them. What I would normally do with these is with the wire strippers, strip the wire back. It's got the little claw that would go inside the wire, snap it, lock it in place. So now it gives you a female connection here. Then you have the male connectors, simply by putting it over and then crimping down on top. You also have the ground loops. This would go on the ground. Again, either solder it, crimp it down, then you have a self-tapping screw, and then you would just screw it to anything that's metal on the vehicle. So for the device, this is basically what the device looks like when you get it in the mail. It has a serial number on the front. It's got the wire harness. The wire harness just plugs right in. You'll see where the clip lines up with the space on top. Plug it right in till it snaps. Make sure it's secured in place. There's your GPS device. On the wire side, it'll have 5 wires. You're not going to use all 5 wires here. The green and the yellow are not used. These are used on certain applications. On most of these installs, those will not be used. The white wire will go to the ignition source, which is when the key is on. If the key is off, this one should not have voltage. The red wire will go to the constant memory, so this one would always have voltage. Whatever wire you find that has voltage constantly, this is it. And this of course would be anything that's made on the vehicle, just your chassis ground wire. This for example is a Kia 2015 Kia Forte. We're going to be using the ignition wires coming off of the key because we know that one's going to have the constant and the ignition, and then of course ground could be found anywhere nearby. So to access it, in this particular instance, you'll have to disassemble the side panel, this bottom dash cover, and this to get to the steering wheel shroud. Once you get this thing off, you'll have the wires coming from the key exposed right underneath here. So I'm going to start off by taking off this cover here. This side of the dash piece has a groove where this can come off. Stick a flathead, it just pops off. Okay. In this vehicle, you're going to expose a couple screws here. Release the OBD plug. Of course, vehicles are going to vary from one manufacturer to the next. So this same step process is not going to be the same for every vehicle. But of course, just all the things to take into precaution when you're taking this off. Make sure you don't pull on it and have these wires come out of the pins or whatnot, because then you'll end up having more issues. So now it gives me room to be able to get the steering wheel column shroud out. And in this case, screws behind the steering wheel. So now you'll see where the key cylinder goes. Here's the wires on the back of it, and this is where you're going to find your constant, your ignition, and then again there's plenty of ground points anywhere around here to be able to have a ground for your GPS. With every GPS device that gets shipped out, they'll send you a handy little blade. And this is where this comes into play. Disconnect the harness. You'll see the power shuts off on the vehicle, but this is where all your wires are located that you're going to need. In this case, I'm just going to pull this tape back. Now that I've exposed them, I'm going to go ahead and plug it back in. Okay, with the ignition off. Again, I'm going to be using my power probe. And then I'm going to test to see which one of these wires has constant. So, using my power probe. Lucky shot. First one that I got, 12 volts. And that's with the ignition off. Keys out of the ignition, so that's going to be my memory wire. That's what the red wire is going to get connected to. And in some cases you'll find more than one constant hot wire, whichever one you use will be just fine, as long as it doesn't lose power with the key off. That's basically the main point. The next wire you're going to be looking for is your ignition wire. The ignition wire will have power when the key is on, but not when the key is off. So to test for that, I'm going to choose a different pin. It's going to show me that the wire does not have power. When I put the key in the ignition, turn it forward, I see it has power at that point. When I crank the vehicle, it maintains power throughout. That's going to be an ignition wire. That's what you're looking for. That's what the white wire will be connected to. This is all raw metal, so I'm gonna call all of this a good grounding point. So with that being said, since I'm catching my wires here, the shortest path for the ground would be to just mount it here. It'd be the same thing as mounting it onto the body of the vehicle. Simply by having that eyelet, if I take that 10mm bolt out, I can put that eyelet and put it right back in there with minimal invasion to the vehicle. That's going to require me splicing some of the wire off of this so I can have some more slack. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the razor blade. Again, the green wire and the yellow wire are not used. I'll go ahead and cut those out of the equation. Small piece of tape just to make sure that these aren't going to touch anything. These are soldered on the tips just to make sure that they don't fray. However, it makes it harder when you're wiring it into the harness. So I cut the tips off on these two. The wires that I found earlier were the green wire as a constant, and the pink wire was my ignition. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go ahead and strip it back. Since this is a heavier gauge wire, instead of trying to pull the wire back because it would just shrivel up, it's better to make a splice on it. Once you expose that wire, you poke a hole through it. Again, verifying that it is 12 volts. We're going to grab our GPS device. We're going to unplug it until we make all our connections. And once we make all the connections, then we can plug it back in. We have our red wire. Again, we've cut off the solder tip. That way it's more flexible. We poked a hole through the wire. We're going to put the wire through the hole, and then we're going to wrap it around. Okay. In some cases, this is considered a good enough connection. You can tape it up, tuck it away, or if you want to go the extra step, we can solder it. And poke the wire through. Okay, if you want to double check, you can plug it back up. You can test your wire. It has ignition. While you're cranking it, it has ignition. And then when you turn the key off, it loses power. So we're going to go ahead and tie the white wire, goes to the ignition again. And put it through the hole that we poked. I'm going to wrap it around. Okay, so this time I'm going to use a different soldering method. Just a small torch. You can find these at smoke shops or gas stations. Basically what you would do is it's instant flame. Add it onto the wire for a few seconds. Count to about 3. Place the solder on top of the wire, and you'll see it melts right onto it. So as you can see, it just melts on top of it. Nice secure connection. And then again, just come back and wrap it with tape. And there you have your main 2 connections. your constant and your ignition. I'm going to plug that back up. If you would, since I took off that tape, make sure you put this thing back on there. Well, it's not sticky anymore, so I'm going to throw a zip tie on top. So you put your ground terminal, and then you simply crimp on back on the top of it. Okay, make sure that the wire's through. You squeeze down, and that's going to lock it in place. Extra protection, you can come back and throw a dab of solder on it. It's not necessarily required, but as long as you have a nice secure connection, you're good there. Now again, what I'm going to use is, you've got a metal base here, there's a 10mm bolt. I'm simply going to remove that and use that for my ground. Just like that, the unit is grounded. So what I want to do next is go ahead and secure my wires to make sure that this isn't going to get yanked by anything around here. Just make sure it doesn't interfere with the telescoping of the steering wheel or the tilting of the steering wheel. Move it up, move it down. There's plenty of room for it to move. If it goes in, if it goes out, it still has slack. Okay. We want to try to mount this device as high as possible in the dash where it's got a clear view of the sky without interference of any kind of metal braces. If it has a brace going across, we want to try to avoid the unit being underneath it, because that affects the signal reception from the GPS. Now if you see on the label, it does tell you label side down. So wherever we mount this, we want to have it as flat as possible with the black side facing up. We're going to go ahead and plug this device in. Okay. Push and snap. It locks in place where the label side down with the clip. You'll see the lights on the front of it. It's got O, C, and G. If you give it after a few seconds, you'll see the light start to flash. Right there, the light is green, but it's very, very dim. So once you see the blue light start flashing, you know that it is locking in a signal. Again, label side down. I'm going to try to find a spot for it. So in this case, I'm going to put this device mounted roughly in this area, just tucked up underneath the dash. I'm going to move it forward, and then I'm going to use a zip tie to secure it using the harness. That way it just sits as high as possible without being in the way of any metal. Just like that, your GPS is installed. Call customer service at 1-800-293-0420 so we can verify that the unit has acquired a signal, has gotten locked in.